My name is the Prophet Sam with Black Sheep Church, the Old Testament timeline. This should give you a overall view of the Old Testament and the story that leads up to Jesus Christ. The creation primeval history. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1. And this is how it all began. God spoke creation into being, and shortly after making man in his own image, he turned away from him when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Turned out of the Garden of Eden because they could not be allowed to eat off the tree of life in a sinful state. Adam and Eve had two sons named Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel out of jealousy and envy and was cursed. Abel sacrificed to God out of the best he had. He wanted to please God. Cain sacrificed to God out of duty and gave only what he thought he could get away with. Cain was banished for his evil, took Neanderthal wives, and created the first city with the goal to multiply mankind's power. This began mankind's quest to replace God, to usurp God's kingdom, and to live in our own power, not in God's. It is important to note, technology, including cities, was started by Cain, who was under a curse from God, and the firstborn human in all creation was a murderer. Adam and Eve had another son and named him Seth, and two different lineages began, one from God in Seth, and one from Satan in the murderer Cain. Humanity started to spread across the earth, and evil went right along with it. The evil men did was so great that God destroyed everything on the face of the earth except for Noah, his family, and the animals on the ark. Genesis chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. Angels were mating with human women and creating a hybrid soul spirit that we call demons today. They will never be allowed in heaven because they are neither angelic nor human. They are not made in God's image. Humanity was restarted, and all of humanity became the children of Noah, who is a descendant of Seth. Cain's lineage was destroyed with the flood. But in no time, humanity was back to the quest of Cain, seeking our own strength through technology. And they built a city, and in the city, the Tower of Babel. Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 7. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Verse 3, they said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Verse 5, but the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." And God separated humanity and spread them across the face of the earth to prevent this in the future. The patriarchal period. The patriarchal period encompasses the lives of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph during the Middle Bronze Age. Abraham lived from 2166 BC to 1991 BC. Jesus the Christ visited Abraham. The scriptures refer to Jesus as Melchizedek, king of Salem, Genesis chapter 14, and taught him in the way of the Lord. Then in chapter 15, verse 6, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. This is the first time we see the doctrine of imputed righteousness, and it is given to man before the Mosaic law. Abraham entered a covenant with God that is called the Abrahamic covenant, in which all the lands of what Israel would one day be were given to Abraham's descendants. Genesis 15. Abraham was commanded by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. Knowing how much he meant to Abraham, it was the ultimate test of his faith. In the end, God provided a ram and spared Isaac's life. The angel of the Lord said this to Abraham: "By myself I have sworn. This is the Lord's declaration. Because you have done this thing, and have not withheld your only son, I will indeed bless you, and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky, and the sand on the seashore. Your offspring will possess the city gates of their enemies." Verse 18, "And all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring, because you have obeyed my command." Genesis 22, 16 through 18. Jacob was the son of Isaac, and father to 12 sons who would later become the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob wrestled with God and was given the name Israel, which means he who wrestles with God. Joseph was son to Jacob and his second wife Rachel. Joseph, who was the youngest, was Jacob's favorite and the one chosen by God to be the father of the family line of King David and eventually the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. Joseph, abused and sold as a slave by his brothers in early life, was a powerful ruler in Egypt in later life. And when he died, the Israelites stayed in Egypt and eventually were made slaves to the Egyptians. Exodus chapter 1. Egyptian bondage and Exodus. Moses was born a Levite and raised in the palace of Pharaoh. A princess of Egypt found Moses drifting down the Nile River and rescued and adopted him. At this time, Pharaoh had ordered all Jewish male children to be killed. Moses was educated and lived the life of a prince until one day he murdered an Egyptian for beating an Israelite and ran away for 40 years. God found Moses and sent him back to Egypt to rescue his people. Exodus chapter 3. Moses did all God commanded, plagues, signs, and wonders, until finally Pharaoh agreed to let the Israelites leave. The death of the firstborn sons of Egypt had a significant impact on the Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Before dawn, Pharaoh had called Moses and Aaron to order the Hebrews out of the land. But the people themselves not only urged the Hebrews to leave, but gave them gold and silver and fine clothing as they left. So began the great migration of the Jews out of Egypt, known as the Exodus. They traveled for 3 months and arrived at Mount Sinai, where Moses received the 10 Commandments, the law of Moses, and where Israel would turn to idols and must wait for the next 40 years before being allowed into the Promised Land. Exodus chapter 19. After the death of Moses, Joshua is put in charge of Israel, the conquest and period of the Judges. In 1406 BC, Israel entered the land of Canaan. It took 7 years to take control of the Promised Land. The first city to fall to Joshua and the Israelites was Jericho. There was a total of 31 cities that fell to Joshua and the Lord. Israel was ordered by God to kill all the people and animals as they moved through the land, to not let their greed and lust get the better of them. But they disobeyed God and are still fighting wars to this day because of it. When the battles were done and it was time to divide up the land, they did it by lot. The decision to divide the land by lot, chapter 14, verse 1 through 5, shows that Israel's gains came about through compliance with the covenant, since Moses originally mandated division by lot as the method to be used when apportioning the land among the tribes. After the death of Joshua, we enter the time of the judges. There were 7 major judges: Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Barak, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. The judges were people chosen by God to protect and deliver Israel from their enemies. They brought the judgment of God. There was a total of 6 cycles of servitude to their enemies and rest. Each cycle of servitude was ended by a judge who God rose up to rescue his people. The united monarchy. Samuel was both a judge and a prophet. He was the last judge. The tribes of Israel complained to Samuel the prophet for a king to fight their battles. Samuel prayed to God and then tried to convince them against a king, but they would not listen. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and went to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Therefore appoint a king to judge us, the same as all the other nations have." When they said, "Give us a king to judge us," Samuel considered their demand wrong. So he prayed to the Lord. Verse 7, "But the Lord told him, listen to the people and everything they say to you. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me as their king. They are doing the same thing to you that they have done to me since the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. Listen to them, but solemnly warn them and tell them about the customary rights of the king who will reign over them." 1 Samuel 8, verses 4 through 9. The era of the United Kingdom was ushered in with Saul being the people's pick for king. The next 120 years, the tribes of Israel would be united under 3 kings: Saul, David, and Solomon. The transition from Saul to David was not easy. Saul was not the king God wanted. David was. And hence Saul spent his last days trying to kill David to protect his kingship. God made a covenant with David and promised that his descendants would reign on the throne for eternity. David prepared the materials needed to build the first temple, but Solomon, his son, built it. Solomon's reign as king was during the apex of Israel's wealth and power. In the end, Solomon worshipped other gods, and because of this and other covenant violations, after he died in 931 BC, the kingdom was divided again. The divided kingdom through the pre-exilic period. Solomon's son Rehoboam took the throne after Solomon's death in 931 BC. Rehoboam was taxing excessively, and it caused the 10 tribes of Israel to reject the house of David and the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. The united kingdom of 12 tribes became 2 kingdoms. The kingdom of Judah, containing the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and the kingdom of Israel, containing the tribes of Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Joseph, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, and Issachar. Over the course of the next 300 years approximately, God sent prophets out to the people of both kingdoms, warning them about covenant disobedience and the consequences of not turning back to God. The nation of Israel and King Ahab turned to the worship of Baal. God sent Elijah to prove he was God alone. God sent his prophet with a message of judgment in hopes of turning wicked King Ahab and his people from the worship of Baal to the worship of Jehovah. Baal was the god of the elements, and the God of Israel was about to declare war on this pagan deity, meeting him on his own turf. In the end, both nations were wicked and would not heed the warnings of the prophets. The northern 10 tribes were taken into captivity by the Assyrians in 722 BC. The southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin were taken into captivity deported, and the temple destroyed from 605 to 586 BC by the Babylonians. The exile. The Jews were in captivity in Babylon from 605 BC until the Persians conquered Babylon in 539 BC. Daniel the prophet was taken into Babylon and found favor with King Nebuchadnezzar. When he interpreted a dream, none of the wise men of Babylon were able to decipher. Nebuchadnezzar was judged by God and made insane for 7 years. When these years ended, his mind was restored to him, as well as his crown, and he worshipped the God of the Jews. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC, and his son, evil Merodach, took the throne. Over the next 23 years, there would be a total of 3 more kings, and in 539 BC, Babylon fell to Persia. The Post-exilic period. After the fall of Babylon, King Cyrus of Persia was moved to help the Jews rebuild the temple of the Lord. He sent Zerubbabel and whomever felt the desire to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple of the Lord. He retrieved the articles that were stolen from the temple when it was destroyed by the Babylonians and sent them along with a treasure to cover the cost of rebuilding. The temple was finished on March 12th, 515 BC. This was only the first of 4 migrations that took place up to 424 BC. The next 3 were led by Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Nehemiah was tasked with rebuilding a wall that had been ruined in many places, and gates that had been burned and torn from their hinges. He faced many obstacles. Nehemiah persisted in the task of rebuilding the walls in spite of the varied opposition he encountered, because the people worked together and had adopted the task as their own. The wall was completed in 52 days. When Nehemiah left Jerusalem, the walls and gates were fixed, and he had initiated reforms that led to a more stable government and gave Israel a chance at renewed covenant obedience. This takes us to the place that sets the stage for the entering of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Christ shows up, and a new chapter of this story begins. We call it today and find it in the thing that we call the Holy Bible, in Scripture, in inspired words of God. We see the fulfillment of the law in Christ. We can look back and see how the Old Testament points time and time again at the future coming Messiah, Jesus the Christ.